How do you balance the outrageously funny with dark, serious material? Amy Schumer talks about that challenge and more when she joins us to talk about her memoir, The Girl with the Lower Back Tattoo.
I think I was in so much pain with what was going on with my family, and I felt very helpless, and I had nowhere else to turn.
What does the process of creating poetry look like? My colleagues Gregory Cowles and Lovia Gayarke will join us to talk about this week's poetry issue. Alexander Alter will give us an update from the literary world. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm Pamela Paul. Amy Schumer joins us now, and she is not only Amy Schumer, but she is also the author of The Girl with the Lower Back Tattoo, which is now out in paperback. Amy, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's scroll back a year to when this is coming out in hardcover and just talk about the backstory of, that's like no pun intended, but the backstory to this book. Like, how did this come about? How did you decide to write a book?
Much like David Sedaris, I also kept journals my whole life. And so it kind of started with just reading back these journals and wanting to find a place for some of the entries. And then also I started being asked to do kind of like tributes or make speeches at events. Like Gloria Steinem asked me to speak at her birthday party. And the response I got to what I wrote, or when I did a tribute to Joan Rivers, and it just really paid off in a way that it felt like it really affected people in a positive way, and it made me interested in seeing if I actually had the potential to book.
So I'm curious about these journals. Why did you start keeping a journal, and what were the kind of things that you recorded in it?
I think I was in so much pain with what was going on with my family, and I felt very helpless. And it was right when my dad got MS, when my parents were getting divorced, and my mom was starting an affair with my best friend's father. And I think it was because I had nowhere else to turn. And we went bankrupt. We were like really poor all of a sudden. It was a lot for a teenager.
I was going to say that's like a cocktail for adolescent angst. It's like a perfect storm.
Yeah. It was like not the coolest age for that to happen. That's why when I read these journals, I just feel bad for the girl. I'm like, oh, hang in there, honey.
And did you find writing to be therapeutic when you were keeping these journals?
Yeah, I think it was definitely therapeutic, and I don't know. I just kind of wanted to have an account of everything. I felt like I needed to document everything, and it's like the most mundane. Some of them are just like, I'm mad at Jen, like she ignored me in study hall, or really kind of detailed things about just starting out sexually, and I got to second base with whoever tonight, and just talking about that and what it felt like, and it's really interesting to look back. I think I'd be interested in doing more with those, but they are pretty painful to read back for me. Like some of them are really funny, and I'm like, I was just so already how I was going to be. Like I was just like, when I get older, I'm like, this guy, he had sex and I made him sleep in the other room. And it's just like the stuff that I still do, where I'm like, oh my God, I was like already so much of my nervous system was set up for how it was going to be.
I'm curious about your progress as a writer. So you started off with journals, and you've written in so many different forums, obviously, writing stand-up pieces, writing performance pieces, and then writing for a TV show, and finally here, writing a book. How different is the process working in those different forms?
I think sort of any writing and its feeling for me are the same, where if it's just a scene for the TV show or writing part of a movie or something, it's like I kind of go under. Like I love to write for hours and hours and hours. Just sit in bed and write, and it's such an escape. And so in that sort of sensibility, I think it's the same, but totally separate from stand-up. I think it's just the most sort of meditative, and it's a really good way for somebody who likes to escape and does not do heroin yet.
But writing with comedy, I've always thought it's such an interesting process because you write something, you get immediate feedback that night, and then you can go back and you can polish it based on the feedback. And so you're like constantly like polishing this little Nitsuki sculpture and making it perfect until you have like the ultimate nugget of comic genius.
That's exactly right. Yeah, it's science. I've never made this analogy before, and I might regret it, but it really is like, the club is like your lab. And so by the time you're filming it on a special or a late night set or whatever, you've tested it. It's been vetted, so you know where the laughs are. It's not like, will they laugh at this tonight? Like, they will, because they've been like your lab rats in a way where it's like, okay, it's ready to be seen. I've done the experiment.
So with a book, though, even though it's a much slower process in a way, because you're writing this enormous thing over 6 months or a year or whatever it might be, the tail end then is much faster, right? You go to your editor, you get some feedback, you go to a second edit, you have a copy edit. Like, you don't have the time for all of that fine tuning or polishing. Did that make it more difficult for you, or was that a relief, or how was it different?
That actually was not my experience. I probably rewrote each of these pieces 10 to 15 times, honestly. And I was working with Casey Dumont, who she's my sister-in-law, and it's really funny because over the years, anytime I've written anything or any speech or anything for a magazine, I send it to her and she would edit it for me, and I just really trust her. And so we got to work on this book together. So it would be like, she would read it and make prompts and suggestions, and we'd reorder it, and I would take another pass at something, and then I'd have friends read it. Like, this was not like, I just kind of spit it out, and it was a real process.
So take that, everyone who thinks that every celebrity book is sort of banged out in an instant. One of the hardest things in a book, in a memoir, in a book of personal essays is tone and kind of striking the right tone between sort of personal and funny and serious and likable and, daring. And I'm curious if you found that the balancing of tone and finding the right voice for the book different from finding your voice in other media.
The book was just pretty all in all dark. Mm-hmm. And, there were moments of things were funny, but it was like sort of had a book deal earlier, and it was like they wanted something for me that I felt I couldn't deliver. Like, I wasn't interested, and I thought other people would be better at doing that. But it's like, they're like, well, can you write a list of the top 10 places you've ever made out with, like something mm-hmm. like that? And I'm just like, no, thanks. But I did understand, just you do want those moments of levity after you hear something like, or read something so heavy.
Right.
I think we just crave that. So tone was something that was not my main focus, but that's what like also my collaborators were good with keeping me on track for. And just like making a movie, the few movies that I've made, that this sort of thought about the tone and that stuff has also come from the people I was collaborating with more than with me.
How did you balance the personal and your childhood versus where you are mm-hmm. now and your professional? Because it seems like you focused more on the personal than on sort of your career trajectory in this book. And was that a deliberate decision?
Not really. I think I more had to be reminded to put career stuff in there. It's just, I was encouraged to write that stuff because people were interested. Like, it really, and I was like, really? Like, I was surprised because I just want to hear about people's personal lives, you know what I mean? But then it's like, no, people will be interested and talk about your sort of like progression and like how it happened for you. Because I find myself watching those late night talk show interviews or an actor's studio or an awards acceptance speech, and I'm just like, who cares? Like, who cares? I'm like, I don't understand just the idea of an actor talking about their process or of a celebrity like talking about the vacation they just went on. Like, I'm just like, it's all so dark to me and like and disturbing. I don't like small talk. It's kind of unbearable for me to listen to, but then it's like, no, well, some people are really interested in how you got from A to B, and so just kind of trusted that.
Was there anything that you felt ambivalent about including on the personal front that you thought, okay, like maybe I shouldn't go here, maybe I shouldn't write about this in this way, or?
Yeah, I was nervous about a lot of it,
What were you most nervous about?
I was most nervous about my sexual assault,
Mm-hmm.
the way I lost my virginity.
Yeah.
I was assaulted, and then and my mom. There's nothing that'll make somebody more vulnerable than talking about their parents. And with mine, like when I recorded the audio of my book, I finished the chapter on my mom, and I just started like completely sobbing in the recording booth. I'm just in Hawaii, in these sound engineers, like these guys must have been like 19, and I just finished that chapter and just sat there and just sobbed, and they just kind of sat there in silence, and then I was like, okay. But with anything where it was like going to be a person that like people knew who it was, and I wasn't using an alias or something. Like my mom read every word in that book, and I was like, if there's anything you don't want me to put, if there's anything you want me to change, or something you. And the only thing she changed was that I had the wrong day of the week that I went to Hebrew school.
What's been the most rewarding thing? The book's been out now for a year. You've gotten feedback. You went on book tour. You've gotten reviews. What's sort of been like the most rewarding thing specifically about writing your own book for you?
Honestly, the money. I'm sorry. It's just so fun to make that joke. Just having someone say, I just read your book feels really nice. I just did a thing with Scholastic where I got to speak at Carnegie Hall in front of like all these kids who got these kind of scholarships.
The Art and Writing Awards?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And actually getting to be in front of them and like just speak to them and just say the things that I kind of wish I'd heard. That was only afforded to me because I wrote that book. So that's what popped in my head. But the most satisfying thing was writing it and working on it with Casey, and then like holding it, getting it sent to me, and like looking at it and being like, I mean, it still feels pretty surreal that it exists, but it was the process.
And so now having that physical book and it's done, do you feel like, okay, I'm finished, I've written my book, I don't need to do that again? Or are you thinking maybe I'll write another book?
No, I'll definitely write another book. I loved it. I really loved it. And I have more secrets that I just wasn't ready to share. And I'm reading some of those journals. I just, there's so many of them, and I love reading other people's journals. So I haven't read Sedaris's yet.
You have to read Sedaris's. They're very
fun. I know.
Fun.
I'm told like that's what I'm rewarding myself with. I've done so much reading for work that I'm like, but I will soon.
And then we'll get your journals, 13 to 30. The diaries.
13 going on 30 journals.
All right, Amy, thank you so much. This was great.
Thank you. This was really fun. Thanks a lot.
Amy Schumer is the author of The Girl with the Lower Back Tattoo, which is now out in paperback. My colleague Greg Cowles joins us now. Our listeners know him as one of our What We're Reading folk, but he is also our poetry editor. Greg, thanks for being here.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
All right. This week we have a special poetry issue of the book review, and the headline on the cover is Poetry in Action.
Yeah. So our New York listeners may remember that probably 15 or 20 years ago, there was a...
You're asking a lot of our New York listeners, not on the podcast, right?
The New York subway system had a campaign going for a while, for a number of years, called Poetry in Motion. And what they would do is up on top of the subway cars where you run ads for skin doctors and things like that, they would, in place of those ads, have a short poem, something kind of pithy that lent itself to a quick read between stations and was a way of bringing poetry to the masses. So it might be a haiku, it might be a Kay Ryan short poem. It was kind of a wide range of different poetry, but Poetry in Motion was the idea. So Poetry in Action riffs on that, obviously. And we went with it for a couple of different reasons. One, there has been a big movement, motion in poetry over at least the last probably 5 years or so of kind of activist poetry.
Yes.
There's always been a strain of activist poetry, and this issue gets at that a little bit, goes back some generations. But it has risen to the forefront again of poets kind of asserting cultural identity, political voice, standing in resistance to kind of structural inequities. Poetry has gotten much more political over the last probably 5 years or so.
Is there like a good slogan, like the political is poetic or the poetic is political? Or
There's not. I'd say one of the people who was groundbreaking in bringing it to the forefront of poetry was Claudia Rankine, her book Citizen, that did so super well. It was a New York Times bestseller. It's poetry, but it's also kind of mini essays, prose poems. It incorporates some visual art in it. And the cover of the book Citizen shows the hood from a hoodie just cut off and left blank. And it seems to be in obvious conversation with the Trayvon Martin case. And in fact, Claudia Rankine is in this poetry-themed issue as a reviewer, not as a reviewed. The other reason that we went with poetry in action as a theme for it is that the issue is anchored by these visual images of draft poems. So I approached a handful of poets. We ended up with 6 different poets, asking them to share with us working drafts of their poems before they were finished, complete with handwritten markups. Robert Pinsky is one of the contributors, and he's got a little doodle of a desk lamp in the margins of his. They each kind of explained how they went from this version to the finished version, or what revision means to them. And so poetry in action, it was to show the process, the kind of the literal action of writing a poem. So you have this wordplay there with action as in activism and action as in the draft process.
So are the poems that are here reproduced in the book review, have these all been published now elsewhere in their final form?
Most of them have, but Jenny Zhang's poem, which is untitled in there, I think is still in draft. It's still in process. She's working towards something finished.
So there are some heavyweight names from the poetry world in this issue, including John Ashbery and Louise Gluck and Allen Ginsberg.
Yeah, the John Ashbery is in there as the subject of a new biography that looks at his early life. Louise Gluck is in there as the author of a book about poetry. It's actually a prose book, but it's kind of her look at how poetry works, what it accomplishes. And Allen Ginsberg is in there with a posthumous book, of course.
Yes.
But he taught for decades and taught poetry and creative writing. And this is a book that compiles his notes as a teacher about the Beat Generation. So it's kind of Allen Ginsberg looks at his peers.
And there's also Jory Graham. Are there new voices as well? 2
of my favorite reviews in this issue, partly because they're so enthusiastic and so smart about the books that they're covering, are both debut books by young poets from small presses. One of them is quite a big small press, Grey Wolf. That's a collection called Whereas by a poet named Layli Long Soldier. She is a member of the Oglala Sioux tribe, and it's reviewed by Natalie Diaz, who is a Native American poet herself. Whereas looks at America's history of the treatment of Native Americans, and it is centered on a congressional statement of apology to Native tribes for our treatment of them. But it kind of spins in the direction of how the bureaucracy uses language to insulate itself against actual consequences. And so it's a collection, sometimes very angry, sometimes very playful, and kind of reclaiming English language for everyone in America, not just for kind of the system structurally. And then the other one is from a tiny press called Delete Press. The name of the book is Giving Godhead. Godhead, all one word there. It's by a young poet named Dylan Krieger. Again, wordplay in the title there. It's obviously very risque. It's a book that grapples very much with sex and sex as trauma. That there's this kind of running theme throughout that suggests that Krieger was abused as a child. She doesn't write directly about that abuse, but she writes about sex as trauma throughout. But it's also trying to celebrate sex, and it's sex and religion. So that's why you get the Godhead play in there. And so she's trying to look for kind of spiritual wholeness in the course of this book. And that's reviewed for us by a guy named Thomas Simmons, who was just really taken by it and connected it to this recent movement called the Girlesque, which is a feminist, playful, very kind of word-drunk movement in poetry.
Read perhaps a little bit of her poetry, but I'm not sure that it would work in this family podcast, newspaper podcast.
Yeah, he had to quote carefully in the course of the review.
Greg, you oversee all of our poetry coverage. How hard is it for you to, given how many books there are published poetry a year, to discover new voices and to decide which ones to, give this kind of attention to?
It's a great question, Pamela. I mean, the fact is no one publication could hope to cover the entire territory. I get just hundreds and hundreds of books of poetry. Some of them are very good, but not really breaking new ground. Some of them very good and breaking new ground, and I still can't hope to cover them all. I mean, even a single issue publication like Poetry Magazine, which is excellent, they have their blind spots, or they can't hope to cover everything. So I see our role at the book review, especially since we cover other things besides, I see our role as kind of giving an overview of, here's the lay of the land. Identifying some exciting new poets, new trends, checking in occasionally with established, well-known poets, kind of following the scholarship, and looking at things like the Allen Ginsberg, people who are still maybe exerting an influence, kind of past masters, but who are still relevant somehow today. So I try to do all of those things. When you bring it together in a special issue like this, you see how those all play against each other. And I think we do some of that throughout here. We've got a tribute to Derek Walcott on the back page, beautiful essay by a poet named Ishyan Hutchinson, who is himself a Caribbean poet, writing very much in Derek Walcott's style. We've got a review by Claudia Rankine. I mentioned she wrote a review in here. It's of two tribute anthologies to the great poet Gwendolyn Brooks, whose centennial was this year.
Well, that actually is a nice spot to introduce a new member of the book staff, Lovia Gayarke, who joins us. Hi, Lovia.
Hi, hello.
So you came from the New Republic, where you recently wrote about Gwendolyn Brooks. You reviewed a biography.
I did. Angela Jackson, I think in this sort of, in celebration of her centennial, a lot of books have come out, including these two anthologies. And Angela Jackson wrote a really great bio about her called A Surprise Queenhood in the New Black Sun, I think. I may have butchered that. But it sort of revisits Gwendolyn Brooks's life, but from the perspective of more of her community activism and her role as essentially a pioneering Black woman in poetry, right? So she won the 1950 Pulitzer Prize.
She was the first African-American to win the Pulitzer.
Yeah, which is an incredible feat in of itself, and somehow hasn't really, I think, hasn't even garnered her, I think, the recognition that she deserves. And so I think Jackson does a really good job of trying to reintroduce this poet that I argue, sort of take for granted sometimes.
All right, well, tell us about Gwendolyn Brooks, for those who aren't familiar with her and her work.
Yeah, so she was born in Kansas, but moved to Chicago when she was really young. And I think even though she sort of maybe is considered sometimes formally a transplant, Chicago was really her muse, the people of Chicago. She really embedded herself in that community, so she was raised there. And she started writing poetry very young. Her first poem was published when she was 13 in the Chicago Reader, which is funny because she applied for a job there later in life and ultimately didn't get it, even though she was a contributing writer for most of her life. But she was very diligent, and I think that's one of the things that was really impressive about her, was that this diligence was sort of born out of observing people around her. And so her poems are really just about everyday people, everyday Black people, and specifically she had this sort of, what I consider a motto, but maybe wasn't for her, this idea that she wanted to represent Black people as not exotics, as just individuals. And I think that, especially for the 50s, right, you're on the cusp of the civil rights movement, you're kind of in the middle of Jim Crow towards the end of it, is really spectacular. I think it does a lot to sort of say, okay, Black people are neither represented as sort of Richard Wright, a native son, as the sort of the aggression of the angry brother of America, but they're also not these people who should only be recognized because of their, incredibly like angelic, forgiving nature in the face of trauma, right? And so a lot of her poems cover just like, what does it mean to fall in love? What is it like to move? And I think that's what the bulk of Annie Allen, her second collection, and the one that won her the Pulitzer, is really about, and why it was just so extraordinary for the committee.
There's like a real documentary impulse to her poetry, and a sense that there's something radical about the documentary impulse when it's being used to show a people who we don't often see kind of day-to-day life.
Yeah.
That the culture doesn't often recognize the day-to-day life.
Definitely.
Is there a collection of hers that you would particularly recommend to our listeners to start with?
Yeah, actually it's not her collection, but her first novel, Maud Martha, that I think that's where I began. That's where my love for Gwendolyn began, and I think is a really accessible way to sort of get a taste of her poetry, but also of this idea of what she was trying to do. So Maud Martha is similar to Annie Allen in that it follows the life of a single Black woman, but it's more of a novel, and it tells the story of Maud Martha from birth to sometime in the post-war period. And I think it's great because it's 37 poems. I actually, in my review, sort of think of it as a precursor to Claudia Rankine's Citizen, and this idea that you write this poetry criticism, except hers is poetry fiction, and you meld these two genres together. And so I would say that's where people should begin if they're really interested. Maybe people who already know her but want something to revisit. The Annie-ad, I think, is really an impressive piece of work.
All right, then. Well, that brings us right back to the theme of poetry in action. Luvia, thanks for joining us.
Yeah,
and
of
Greg.
course. Thank you.
Sure, thank you.
So Greg Cowles and Luvia Garge, and our poetry issue, which is online now. Our intrepid publishing reporter, Alexandra Alter, joins us now to talk about what's going on in the literary world. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, Pamela.
What are we talking about this week?
This week, there are lawsuits to discuss and big book deals. So a lot of publishing news this week. On the big book deals front,
You're starting with the good news and then
I'm
we go
gonna
to the
start-
bad news, or is it vice versa?
It depends on what side you're on the lawsuit.
All
you
right.
could view it as good news. We'll see how you feel. The big news in terms of deals this week is former FBI Director James Comey, whose proposal has been out with publishers for several weeks now, finally made a deal with Flatiron Books. And it's interesting, they seem to be kind of ramping up their political publishing arm. They recently acquired books by Joe Biden and Jill Biden.
Oh, interesting.
So this is another big get for them. This was a heated auction. I think all the major houses were bidding on this book. Of course, Mr. Comey has been in the news, particularly with the Russia investigation and his firing by President Trump. Everyone's going to want to hear his side of the story. He's promising new details. It's not really a conventional memoir. He's basically says he's going to be drawing lessons about leadership and ethics from his 2 decades of experience in government.
What's really interesting is that there have been a number of deals recently where it's like what people want is the memoir and what they're getting is the book on leadership.
Exactly. Yeah. I think he's trying to walk the line between those two things. They were explicit that there will be previously undisclosed details about some of his experiences. And so I think people are really hoping, to hear more about what his encounters with the Trump administration were like. Another interesting thing about this deal is the book is coming out very quickly. It's coming out next spring. And his agents tell me he's writing it himself and he's already hard at work on it. And they said the reason he feels such urgency to write it quickly is because he wants to get out and give interviews and talk. And, he hasn't really given a major interview at all. He gave his testimony to Congress, but he hasn't, really said much, at least to the press. So it'll be interesting to see him kind of on the press tour for this book and how frank he's going to be about his feelings and his opinions of the Trump-Russia question.
All right, a little bit of inside baseball questions. Flatiron Books, which house is that part of?
So that is part of Macmillan. And, there are big names so far. I mentioned Jill Biden. They also have Oprah, of course, that she's a huge figure within publishing. She has her own imprint there, her memoir. So I think those are, those are their big kind of
They've done kind of some other celebrity type of books.
Yes, that's right. Exactly.
Okay. All right, let's get to another aspect of the law.
Yes. So in other legal news this week, there's a lawsuit that I've been following because I wrote about this company last year. It's called Kinderguides. The publishing house is Moppet Books, and Kinderguides are these picture books based on classic novels. They did a version of Jack Kerouac's On the Road, Capote's Breakfast at Tiffany, Ernest Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea, and aimed at sort of the 6 to 12-year-old market. Kids that are a little young, one might think, for serious novels like that. So they kind of condense the plot, into a picture book format.
Were these totally in earnest, or was there some irony to them?
They were very, very earnest. There are other picture books based on classic novels that are more kind of tongue-in-cheek and kind of aimed at the hipster parent market. Like there's one based on Moby Dick that I find hilarious.
How does it start?
Babies. And there's another one based on Jane Eyre. I mean, there's sort of this niche in publishing, and it's mostly, I think, to amuse the parents who get tired of reading Pat the Bunny over and over. So there was the pedagogical question about whether or not, young kids really should be reading Hemingway at this, when they're just learning how to read. There was also a legal question. When I wrote the piece, I called a couple of copyright experts and said, these are books that are essentially taking the characters and the plots of these famous novels, some of which are not in the public domain yet. They're still under copyright. Is this a violation? And, one expert I talked to said, looks like it. Mm-hmm. And a few weeks later, a lawsuit was filed by Simon & Schuster and Penguin Random House in conjunction with the estates of 4 famous writers, Capote's estate, Jack Kerouac's estate, Hemingway's estate, and Arthur C. Clarke, because Kinderguides did a version of 2001: A Space Odyssey. So this has been before a judge who was looking at the question of whether these were in fact teaching guides, which you can do under fair use, or if they were copyright violations, because they were really just copying what was already out there and taking the plots and settings and characters wholesale. And the judge ruled that these are copyright violations. He ruled in favor of the estates and the publishing houses. So it's a bit of a blow to Moppet Books and Kinderguides. Of course, there are plenty of books in the public domain. If this is their thing, they can continue in that vein. And they are planning to do books like Pride and Prejudice. So I think, the business could survive, but they're going to have trouble if they want to do contemporary literature or famous novels that are still under copyright.
It reminds me of those board books that explain advanced scientific
physics, quantum physics for babies.
Yes,
coding for babies.
My 12-year-old and 10-year-old and 8-year-old find fascinating and hilarious, but I don't know if it has enlightened them about those subjects particularly.
Exactly.
All right. Well, never too young to start causing a lawsuit.
Exactly.
All right. Thanks, Alexandra.
Thanks, Pamela.
Joining us now to talk about what we're reading, my colleagues Greg Cowles and Jenny Schuessler joining us as a special guest, and a new employee of the Book Review, Lauren Christensen. Hi, guys.
Hi.
All right. So let us start with our special guest, Jenny Schuessler.
So what am I reading?
What are you reading?
I'm relieved to report I am reading something, because sometimes when you've asked me to be a special guest, I'm in some kind of a TV watching jag that I am.
Jenny Schuessler, who reports on ideas for the New York Times.
Yeah, but I've actually been reading a couple of novels. I actually have polished off a few novels in recent days, I can say. So I was at the beach in New Jersey over the weekend, and I borrowed a copy of Mohsin Hamid's recent novel, Exit West.
Oh, yes. What did you think?
I really liked it. It was very moving, really beautifully done. I wouldn't call it a beach read, but it was the perfect thing when you actually had 4 hours.
There are a lot of beaches in it, though.
That's true. Yeah.
Did you compare it in your mind to the Underground Railroad?
That's funny. I did not at the time, but then I was talking about it at lunch over the weekend with the person who lent it to me, and she sort of made that association. I mean, it's interesting because it also involves a kind of magical conveyance, which wasn't an actual Underground Railroad, but it was this sort of some kind of unspecified system of wormholes where people. So the book, it's sort of about. It seems to sort of be reflective of kind of the experience of refugees and immigrants today, where these sort of mysterious kind of manhole type, holes appear in different places, kind of war-torn or otherwise distressed places, and people kind of start popping up all over the world. And but it doesn't sort of dwell a lot on the mechanics of it. It just sort of happens. So no, I didn't make that association, but it's kind of an interesting one.
And you have another book in front of you.
Yeah, so then I started reading, on the train back, I started reading this new novel, which I believe has just been published by Dan Senna, called New People. I think it's
I just read it myself.
Oh, you just read it yourself? Okay, no spoilers, because I'm only in the middle. But she's a writer I really like. I loved her first novel, Caucasia, which I think was published about 15 years ago. So I was really happy when this one kind of landed on my desk. And it's set in Brooklyn in the mid-'90s, which is gives me a warm, nostalgic feeling. It also has a subplot involving a dissertation, which I also really like. Not really sure how that's going to pan out. So just to sort of summarize, it's about this woman in her 20s, a biracial African-American woman who's sort of kind of wrestling a lot with her own identity. She's very light-skinned, and she is sort of dealing with all these issues of her own identity, how other people perceive her. Sort of similar themes to Caucasia, but it's at least so far much more in a kind of comic, slightly satiric mode. And there's a great, I was trying to think of a great passage to read. It's not kind of quite that sort of book, but there's this, I just sort of finished this great scene involving a misadventure on a fire escape, which I thought was very funny and just sort of weird, and one of those things where it's a dumb question when you're talking about writers, but you just think how did you come up with that? I don't know. I hope it's not inspired by real life. That's all I can say.
Greg, what are you reading?
Have you guys heard of the French witer Emmanuel Carrère?
Greg is joking. We've been talking about him obsessively on the podcast.
Carrère has kind of infected us one by one in the book review like a virus passing around. Thanks largely to our colleague Barry Guin, who has been a fan going back years, and he's kind of pushed him on us. And so I know that Jen Salai and I think Paul Sagal, maybe John Williams, all in previous weeks have talked about reading one Carrère book or another. The one that I'm reading now is one that none of them have talked about yet. It's his new book, The Kingdom, which I have to say it's the first Carrère that I've read, and I'm about 50 pages in. It's off to kind of a slow start for me because it's hugely about religion, Christianity, and specifically Catholicism. Carrère converted to Catholicism in his early 30s, and I should say I'm a Catholic convert myself, but there's something in his description of his conversion. He since relinquished his conversion. He's now agnostic or atheist again, as he was before his conversion. He's going back and reconstructing all of this, and there's something both kind of semi-embarrassed about the fact that he was so fervent about it, but he was really fervent about it. And so there's something very kind of godly and preachy about it too, in kind of an off-putting way. He's
about the book or about his description?
No, about the religion.
Mm-hmm.
About his
depiction of the religion?
His depiction, he would read a Bible passage a day and kind of meditate on it and write about it. And he just, surrendered himself to, it's a little bit embarrassing. It's like reading about somebody's middle school crush. It's all very deeply felt. Again, he's clearly embarrassed going back and reading about it now. And I know from reviews that the book will pivot at some point and talk not about his conversion, but about the conversion of St. Paul, who, of course, was previously Saul of Tarsus. And I'm not there yet. So it becomes, instead of this kind of personal testament, it becomes a historical novel about the very earliest days of Christianity. We'll see. It's Carrère, as I know from Barry and as I know from hearing you all talk about it on the show here, does a real blend of the personal and the fictional in his work, and it's sometimes a hard line to distinguish. Right now, what I'm reading still feels very memoirish, and I'm a skeptic, but I'm open to converting.
All right, let's have a brief non-Carrère moment. And Lauren, you are not reading Emmanuel Carrère. What are you reading?
I am not. So I've actually just finished Elif Batuman's The Idiot. Having never read the Dostoevsky, I now am moved to for the first time. So I guess she's gotten me over that hump, which is a real testament to her. I was just
fascinated by this novel. I think what was so interesting about it, it's set in 1995 at Harvard. It's, one of my favorite genres, the campus novel. So I'm drawn to characters like Selim. She's a Turkish descent student, and she's sort of, on the surface, she doesn't ever want to make any judgments about the world. And so her friends can kind of criticize her for being too agnostic or, indifferent to the things around her, but she's really processing things on a level that I think so many people who do talk about their judgments aren't really making those kind of silent, very, very considered intellectual decisions. And I think one of the things that I love about this book is its treatment of emails, which is obviously very new in 1995. Selim conducts this entire relationship with a sort of older, kind of enigmatic student named Ivan. And one of the things I love is that it's kind of in vogue right now to criticize email and digital communication overall. The millennial generation doesn't know how to communicate face-to-face anymore, and everything that's lost in such and such when you're just typing instead of talking.
Lauren says this as a millennial, let me just say.
And one of the things I love is I think this book really explores what one can say and the ways that language is opened up in when it's written as opposed to face, and how not necessarily more, but what different meaning can come through sort of a digital life. And I think they're sort of created two narratives. One is the email narrative, which has its own cadence and its own significance, and it's this relationship conducted in email. But of course, they do see each other in person, and that almost becomes a different thread. And so these threads overlap and also run parallel sometimes and don't intersect, and I think that's a beautiful skill that she has. Interestingly, right after I finished that book, I picked up Conversations with Friends by Sally Rooney. There's another novel about this one set in modern day Ireland instead of sort of 20 years ago, but the threads are very similar. It's also a digitally conducted relationship in large part, and sort of dealing with these really prodigiously smart young women who find ways to kind of revolutionize digital communication in terms of just how they not only conduct their relationships with men, but also how they see the world and make sense of it when it's all seems to be crumbling around them.
It's interesting that now we've gotten far enough into the digital era that it's not just a question of situating a book either pre-digital era or post, but even to different, periods within the digital era. Yeah. Like you can have the MySpace novel or whatever.
Absolutely.
Early digital zone, time. All right, well, I'm going to return us to the true subject here, Emmanuel Carrère, because I just finished Lives Other Than My Own, which Jen Salai talked about on an earlier podcast. The book review actually did not review this book. I don't know why. We sometimes make these errors. But it's a very hard book to describe without giving it away, because I think one of the interesting things, Greg, you mentioned this, that the book is going to pivot. And this book pivots several times so that you come into it thinking it's going to be about one thing, and then you find that it turns into something else and then into something else again. And those surprises are part of what makes it such an interesting and engrossing reading experience. So I don't want to give too much away. I can say that it starts with the 2004 tsunami in Sri Lanka, which was also the setting of a book that I love and that many here at the Book Review love, which was Sonali Damraniagala's memoir, Wave. And I'm, as I confessed last week, a fan of tsunamis in general and of very sad memoirs. And so this starts out in precisely that sweet spot for me. But Carrère and his family are not directly affected by the tsunami, but they are surrounded by people whose lives are, and thus the title, Lives Other Than My Own. And in a way, the entire book is an exploration of how people's lives are linked to others and how things that don't directly affect one person end up affecting them, and how our lives are, in one sense, literally carried by other people. And it's really quite beautiful and moved me to tears in a couple of spots. There was a story that the New York Times Magazine did earlier this year about Carrère tied to his latest book, The Kingdom. And the title of that story was How Emmanuel Carrère is Changing or Reimagining Nonfiction. And I want to quote actually from that magazine story, which quotes from the book, because I think it describes in part what is so incredibly innovative about Carrère's work. And I think as far as my reading goes kind of unique to him. So this is from Wyatt Mason's piece about Emmanuel Carrère, and he's talking about this book, Lives Other Than My Own. There's an amazing little moment in the book that gets at what Carrère is able to do. Carrère is just awaking to the devastation of the tsunami in Sri Lanka, and he is walking around meeting people who are seeking their loved ones in vain. He comes upon an English tourist, quote, an overweight, middle-aged Englishwoman with short hair who had just lost her girlfriend, unquote. And here's the passage from the book. I imagined the two of them getting on in years, living in a lovingly tended house in an English town, taking part in its social life, going on a yearly trip to some distant country, putting together their photo albums, all that shattered. The survivors return. The empty house. Each woman's mug with her name on it, one of them forever forlorn. And this heavy woman sitting slumped at the kitchen table with her head in her hands, weeping, telling herself that she's all alone now and will be until she dies. Going back to the piece. Among the many astonishing passages that stands out in Lives Other Than My Own, Michel Houellebecq says, the most heartbreaking for me is about the old English lesbian who had just lost her companion in the catastrophe. Carrère did, in fact, meet this woman during the holidays in Sri Lanka that ended so terribly, but he imagined the mugs. This seems to me the margin of invention Carrère finds in this book where, quote, everything is true. It's not insignificant. Because they're not nothing, these mugs. It was exactly at the moment of the mugs, I remember, that I burst into tears, and then I had to put the book down, unable for a few minutes to continue reading. Unquote. So that's Michel Houellebecq talking about Carrère, and I think he puts it very well. I'm going to end on that solemn note, but I hope it draws people to the book, because it really is. It's one of those books that I think you have to read to really get at what he's doing in the book, and like Houellebecq, I cried too.
Got it. I want to either run out and buy the book immediately or jump out the window. I can't.
Yes. Well, you know what? You can borrow this book from Barry, as I did, because I'm about to return it to him. So, Jenny, Greg, Lauren, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Inside the New York Times Book Review is produced by Pedro Rosado. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.